They say the only thing more dangerous than a mafia boss is the woman who taught him how to bleed. For 6 months, Nyakareen Vale wore the crown of the Seven Stars Circle like it was forged for her, standing side by side with Han Di Ryle. But on the eve of their first wedding anniversary, the trap didn't come from an enemy's gun. It came in a white envelope containing a single lock of hair and a photo of a child with Di Ryle's eyes. Nya thought she had secured her place at the table, but she was about to learn that in the underworld, the past never stays buried. It just waits for you to get comfortable before it pulls you into the grave. The queen was ready for war, but she wasn't ready for a truth that could break her heart more than any divorce ever could. Before we begin, please hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let's dive in. The Grand Hyatt Ballroom was a cathedral of light and sound, a shimmering testament to the new era of the Seven Stars Circle. It had been exactly 1 year since the blood-soaked Valentine's Day that had nearly torn them apart, and tonight, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the expensive hum of victory. Nyakareen Vale stood at the top of the marble staircase, her presence a silent roar that commanded the room. She wore a gown of liquid midnight silk that clung to her curves like a second skin, her hair crowned with a delicate gold leaf tiara that caught the flash of every camera. Beside her, Han Di Ryle was a shadow in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his hand resting possessively at the small of her back. They weren't just a couple, they were a monument to survival. "To the king and queen," the elders toasted, their voices oily with a new, terrified respect. Nya accepted their praise with a sharp, knowing smile, her eyes scanning the crowd with the clinical precision of a woman who had learned to count the knives hidden behind every tuxedo. The night was perfect, a seamless blend of power and prestige, until the heavy double doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open with a slow, ominous weight. A young man, dressed in the humble, dark robes of a traditional courier, walked through the sea of socialites. He ignored the security detail and stepped toward the dais, holding a single, heavy white envelope sealed with wax the color of dried blood. The music faltered, a dissonant chord ringing out as the courier bowed low, extending the package to Di Ryle. With a frown, Di Ryle broke the seal. As he pulled the contents out, his face, usually a mask of impenetrable stone, shattered. A single lock of dark, silky hair fell from the envelope, landing on the white tablecloth like a dead moth. Beneath it was a glossy DNA report and a photograph of a 5-year-old boy sitting on a traditional wooden porch, his eyes a haunting, unmistakable mirror of Di Ryle's own. Nya felt the temperature in the room plummet. She looked from the photo to her husband, seeing a ghost haunt his features that she had never encountered before. The celebratory air evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, ancient dread. The trap hadn't come from the council this time. It had come from a grave. A voice from the shadows of the doorway whispered a name that made the most powerful man in Seoul tremble: Min-hee. The past had arrived to collect its debt, and Nya realized with a sickening jolt that her crown was suddenly resting on a foundation of lies she hadn't even begun to uncover. The celebration did not end with a bang, but with a suffocating, leaden silence that trailed them from the ballroom to the penthouse like a funeral shroud. The Grand Hyatt's glittering lights were miles behind them, yet the image of the lock of hair and the glossy DNA report remained seared into the back of Nya's eyelids. Inside the apartment, the air was brittle. Di Ryle had not spoken a single word since the courier had bowed his way out of existence. He had marched straight to his study, his tuxedo jacket discarded on the floor of the foyer, a trail of expensive wool that signaled the total collapse of his composure. Nya followed him, her midnight silk gown rustling against the cold marble floors. She found him standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the same spot where he had once handed her a divorce that wasn't a divorce. But tonight, he wasn't looking out at the city he ruled. He was staring down at the photograph clutched in his trembling hand. Under the harsh, recessed lighting of the study, the boy in the picture looked back at them with a haunting familiarity. The same high cheekbones, the same defiant set to the jaw, and eyes that held the weight of 1,000 secrets. How long? Nya's voice was a low, dangerous rasp that cut through the silence. D-Ryle didn't turn. His shoulders, usually broad and unshakable, were hunched as if under the weight of a physical blow. The silence stretched, becoming a wall of ice between them. It was a return to the silent room of their past, a regression that made Nya's blood run cold. She had fought too hard for her seat at his table to be shut out by a ghost now. "I didn't know," he finally whispered, his voice so thin it barely reached her. He turned slowly, his face drained of color, his eyes hollowed out by a visceral, ancient shock. "Min-hee. She was gone. Before the circle took everything, before I became what I am. I was told she died in the purge of the northern factions." Nya stepped closer, the gold-leaf tiara on her head feeling like a crown of thorns. She reached out, snatching the photo from his hand. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable. The boy was roughly 5 years old, tucked away on a rustic porch in a part of the country where the 7 stars' reach was supposed to be absolute. "And now she's back," Nya countered, her eyes searching his for a lie she prayed she wouldn't find. "Back with a child who has your blood and a threat that could dismantle everything we've built. Do you realize what the council will do when they find out the king has a vulnerable heir out in the wild?" D-Ryle didn't answer. He simply looked at Nya, and for the first time in a year she saw fear in him, not for his own life, but for the impossible choice that was forming in the shadows. The partnership they had signed in blood felt suddenly fragile, a glass palace under siege. As he turned his gaze back to the dark horizon, Nya realized that the man she loved was already drifting back into the deep, cold ocean of his secrets, leaving her standing alone on the shore of their shared empire. Nya did not wait for the dawn to bring her answers. While D-Ryle remained paralyzed by the window, a statue of grief and regret, she shed her midnight silk gown and donned a tactile, charcoal-colored tactical suit that allowed her to move like a shadow through the silent penthouse. She descended to the private morgue in the sub-basement of their headquarters, a place where the syndicate's secrets were buried in stainless steel drawers. The courier from the gala had not survived his delivery. Kim's men had been efficient, perhaps too efficient. Nya pulled back the heavy plastic sheet covering the young man's body. The clinical glow of the overhead LED lights drained the room of warmth, reflecting off the cold surfaces. She began her examination not with fear, but with the cold, calculating focus of a woman who had once dismantled a financial empire with a few keystrokes. She found what she was looking for on the inside of the courier's left wrist. It was a tattoo, small but intricate, hidden beneath the skin's surface with UV-reactive ink that only bloomed under a forensic light. As she clicked on her handheld blacklight, a deep crimson flower materialized, a peony, its petals curled in a way that suggested a blooming fire. It wasn't the jagged, modern branding of the 7 stars circle. This was older, more traditional, and carried the weight of a history that predated the city's skyscrapers. "The Red Peony Society," a voice rasped from the doorway. Nya didn't flinch. She knew Kim's footfalls. The enforcer stepped into the light, his expression grim. "They are a ghost story, ma'am. A traditionalist sect that vanished 40 years ago. They believe in blood purity and the old ways of the clans. If they have the boy, they aren't just holding a child. They are holding a claim to the throne that bypasses the council entirely." Nya traced the glowing red ink with a gloved finger. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a ransom, it was a purification rite. The Red Peony Society didn't want money. They wanted a pure bloodline, and they viewed her, a black woman who had seized power in their sacred Korean hierarchy, as an infection that needed to be excised. The child was their weapon of choice to replace her. "They think I'm a temporary distraction," Nya whispered, her eyes narrowing as the peony glowed brighter under the violet light. "They think they can use a 5-year-old's eyes to make D-Ryle flinch." She turned to Kim, her face set in a mask of lethal determination. "Find out where the society's old guard meets. If they want to play with ghosts, I'll show them that I'm the one who haunts this city now." She left the morgue with a new kind of fire in her veins. D-Ryle was mourning a past he thought was dead, but Nya was already preparing for a future that required her to be more ruthless than the monsters under the bed. The red peony had bloomed in her garden, but she was going to make sure she was the one who tore it out by the roots. The coldness of the bed was what woke her. It was a hollow, biting chill that seeped into her bones, signaling that the space beside her had been empty for hours. Nya reached out a hand, her fingers brushing against the silk sheets of the expansive California king bed, finding only the lingering scent of sandalwood and the ghost of a presence that had already fled. In the pale, pre-dawn light filtering through the penthouse windows, the room looked like a mausoleum of their shared life. She didn't call his name. She knew better. Han Ryle did not linger in the hallways when he was retreating into himself. He became a phantom, slipping through the cracks of his own empire. But as she sat up, her dark curls cascading over her shoulders and her eyes sharp with a sudden, icy clarity, Nya felt a surge of familiar fury. He was doing it again. He was reverting to the man who thought isolation was a shield, trying to protect her by leaving her in the dark. "Not this time," she whispered to the empty room. She threw back the duvet and moved with purpose, her bare feet silent on the heated marble floors. She didn't head for the kitchen or the closet. She went straight to the secondary study, the one that housed her private servers, the digital heart of her power. She shed her silk nightgown and pulled on a heavy black cashmere robe, the weight of it grounding her. As she sat before the array of monitors, the blue light washed over her face, turning her skin to polished obsidian. With a few rhythmic strokes of her keyboard, she reactivated the ghost web she had built months ago. She didn't just look for his car or his phone. She looked for the anomalies in the city's heartbeat. She bypassed the official 7-Stars security protocols, knowing Kim would have scrubbed his boss's trail from the syndicate's logs. Instead, she tapped into private satellite feeds and high-frequency traffic sensors. A pulse appeared on her screen, a black luxury SUV moving with predatory speed toward the outskirts of the Gyeonggi province, far from the neon reach of the Gangnam district. He was heading for the mountains, toward a sector where the old clans still held sway, and the laws of the modern city dissolved into ancient blood feuds. The sight of his retreating signature on the map ignited a cold fire in her chest. For 3 years, she had been a secret, and for 1 year, she had been a queen. She had learned that a throne was not a gift given by a man. It was a position maintained through vigilance. If Ryle thought he could sacrifice himself to the Red Peony Society to buy her peace, he had forgotten who had saved his life in the tea house. Nya watched the blinking cursor of his location and began to upload the coordinates to her own encrypted mobile device. She wasn't the bait anymore, and she certainly wasn't the mourning wife left behind. She was the architect of his safety, whether he wanted it or not. As the first light of dawn touched the Seoul skyline, Nya closed her laptop and reached for her tactical gear. The king was running into a trap, but he had forgotten that the queen was the one who knew how to spring it. The winding roads of the Gyeonggi Mountains were choked with mist, the ancient pines standing like sentinels guarding the secrets of the valley. Nya steered her motorcycle with a rhythmic, lean-muscled grace, the engine's growl muffled by the damp air. She had tracked the SUV's signal to the base of a jagged ridge where a hidden stone path ascended toward the clouds. Leaving the bike concealed beneath a canopy of ferns, she moved upward on foot, her breath coming in shallow, controlled bursts. The temple appeared out of the fog like a ghost from a different era. Known as the Temple of Whispers, it was a sprawling complex of weathered wood and gray stone, its eaves upturned like the wings of a predatory bird. There were no modern lights here, only the flickering orange glow of lanterns swinging in the wind. Nya moved through the shadows of the outer courtyard, her tactical boots making no sound on the moss-covered stones. As she rounded the corner of the main prayer hall, she saw him. Ryle was standing in a small, enclosed garden where the white petals of plum blossoms fell like slow-motion snow. He looked smaller here, stripped of the glass and steel authority of the city. But it was the woman standing across from him that made Nya's heart stop. She was ethereal, a vision of traditional Korean beauty dressed in a pale, ivory hanbok that seemed to catch the moonlight. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant bun held by a jade pin, the mark of a woman of high standing. This was not a modern assassin or a syndicate soldier. This was Min Hee. Nya watched from the darkness of a stone archway, her hand instinctively resting on the hilt of the blade at her thigh. The air between Ryle and Min Hee wasn't filled with the heat of a current romance, but with the heavy, suffocating weight of a shared history. Ryle reached out, his hand hovering inches from Min Hee's face before he pulled it back, as if afraid the vision would dissolve into smoke. "You were dead," Ryle's voice carried through the garden, cracked and raw. "I burned the incense for you for 5 years." "I was hidden," Min Hee replied, her voice a soft, melodic chime that masked a hidden steel. "The red peony kept me safe when you could not, and now they have our son, Ryle. They have the boy you thought never existed." Nya felt the world tilt on its axis. The sight of them together, the king and his first love, framed by the ancient architecture of a forgotten world, felt like a betrayal more profound than any lie. Min Hee wasn't just a mother. She was a bridge to a past where Nya did not exist, a past that offered Ryle a pure legacy that no amount of syndicate power could buy. Nya stayed in the shadows, her eyes locked on Min Hee's serene face. She saw the subtle glint of triumph in the woman's eyes, a look that only another queen would recognize. Min Hee wasn't just there for her son. She was there to reclaim a throne she believed was rightfully hers. Nya felt the cold weight of her own crown, realization dawning that her greatest enemy wasn't a hitman, but a memory that had suddenly taken breath. The stillness of the temple garden was brittle, a fragile glass sphere that shattered the moment Nya stepped from the shadows. The plum blossoms continued their slow, mocking descent, but the air between the three of them surged with a new, violent electricity. Ryle spun around, his eyes widening as they landed on Nya. He looked caught between the relief of seeing her and the terror of what her presence meant in this sacred, dangerous space. Min Hee did not flinch. She remained poised, her hands folded neatly within the voluminous sleeves of her ivory hanbok, her expression shifting from serene mourning to a sharp, cold calculation. She looked at Nya's tactical gear, the charcoal fabric, the holstered blade, the high-tech comms, with a disdain that felt centuries old. "So this is the asset the Circle talks about," Min Hee said, her voice like silk over a razor. She didn't look at Ryle, her gaze was fixed entirely on Nya. "The woman who thinks a throne can be bought with digital ghost stories and foreign influence." "I am the woman who saved his life when your red peony ghosts were busy hiding in the mountains," Nya countered, her voice steady and echoing against the stone walls. She walked toward them, stopping just far enough away to keep both within her line of sight. "Explain yourself, Min Hee, or I'll let Kim and the SUVs outside decide how this reunion ends." Min Hee let out a soft, hollow laugh. "I was forced into the shadows, Nya. When the council realized I was carrying the true heir to the 7 stars, they didn't see a miracle. They saw a threat to their control over Ryle. They staged the purge. They told him I was dead so they could mold him into their puppet. The Red Peony Society didn't kidnap me. They preserved the bloodline that you are currently polluting." She turned her gaze back to Ryle, her eyes softening into a practiced, manipulative warmth. "The boy, your son, is being raised in the old ways, Ryle. He knows your face from the stories I tell him, but he cannot come home to a house built on a lie. He cannot have a father who keeps a foreign consort in the seat that belongs to his mother." Min Hee stepped forward, the silk of her chima whispering against the moss. "If you want to see the boy, if you want the true family to be whole again, she has to go. Nya must step down. She must return the keys to the ghost accounts and disappear, just as I once did. It is the only way the society will release the heir." The silence that followed was suffocating. Nya looked at Ryle, searching for the man who had promised her a partnership built on truth. He looked at the ivory-clad woman from his past, then at the woman who had redefined his future. The mother's gambit was perfect. It struck at the only thing Ryle valued more than power, his legacy. "Ryle," Nya said, her voice dropping to a warning whisper. "Don't let a memory talk you into a grave. She's not asking for a family, she's asking for a surrender." But D-Ryle remained silent, his gaze fixed on the dirt at his feet, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. The trap had been set on Valentine's Day, but the real jaws were closing now, and for the first time, Nya realized that even a queen could be checkmated by a ghost. The temple garden had become a theater of shadows, the moonlight carving sharp, jagged lines into the faces of everyone present. Nya stood her ground, her eyes never leaving Minhee, but her focus was on the subtle, discordant notes in the woman's performance. There was a rhythm to Minhee's grief that felt too rehearsed, a cadence to her demands that smelled of a ledger rather than a mother's heart. The Red Peony Society didn't just preserve a bloodline, Minhee, Nya said, her voice dropping into a register of cold, analytical steel. They weaponized it. You talk about purity and family, but you're wearing the silk of an organization that hasn't functioned without a benefactor in 40 years. Nya moved toward the stone table where a ceramic tea set sat undisturbed. With a quick, decisive movement, she pulled a handheld scanner from her tactical belt, a high-frequency device tuned to detect the encrypted signatures of the very ghost accounts she had once controlled. As the light swept over Minhee's ivory sleeves, a sharp, rhythmic ping echoed through the courtyard. "You aren't a refugee," Nya hissed, her eyes flashing with a dangerous realization. "You're an operative. Those accounts I ghosted to save D-Ryle's life. You've been trying to bypass the encryption for months. The Society didn't save you from the Council. They bought you from them." D-Ryle's head snapped up, the fog of his shock finally pierced by Nya's logic. He looked at Minhee, his gaze traveling from her tear-brushed eyes to the hidden pocket in her chima, where a modern, encrypted uplink device sat nestled against her skin. The ivory handbok was no longer a symbol of innocence. It was a uniform. "Where is he, Minhee?" D-Ryle's voice was a low, terrifying growl that made the lanterns overhead rattle. "Where is my son?" Minhee's composure didn't break, it simply transformed. The soft, grieving mother vanished, replaced by a high-ranking lieutenant of a forgotten war. She stepped back, a cold smirk touching her lips. "He is where the foreign influence can never reach him. He is at the Iron Crag Fortress, nestled in the peak above the Gyeongsang border. He is being held not as a child, but as the price of your return to the old ways." She looked at Nya, her eyes devoid of warmth. "The Society doesn't care about your money, Nya. They care about the fact that as long as you exist, the Seven Stars Circle is a mongrel empire. The boy is the ransom for D-Ryle's soul. If he wants the child to live, he must bring them your head on a platter of gold." The revelation hung in the air like a poisoned mist. The ransom of blood wasn't a financial demand. It was an ethnic and political cleansing. The boy was the bait, Minhee was the lure, and the mountain fortress was the cage. Nya felt a strange, icy calm settle over her. She looked at D-Ryle, whose face was now a map of pure, unadulterated fury. For the first time, she saw that his fear had been replaced by a singular, lethal purpose. "Pack the ivory away, Minhee," Nya said, her hand resting firmly on her holstered weapon. "Because we're coming for that fortress. And I promise you, by the time the sun rises, the Red Peony won't just be a memory, it will be extinct." The descent from the temple was a blur of shadows and engine heat, but the silence inside the black SUV was a living thing, heavy and jagged. D-Ryle sat behind the wheel, his knuckles white against the leather, his eyes fixed on the winding mountain road with a 1,000-yard stare that Nya had seen only once before, the night he thought he had lost his soul. He was already mourning, already preparing to walk into the Iron Crag alone to pay the blood price for a son he hadn't known he had. "Pull over," Nya said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a gavel. D-Ryle didn't blink. "I have to get you to the safe house. Minhee is right about one thing. The Society won't stop until the line is pure. I won't let them have you." "I said pull over, D-Ryle." He slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming against the gravel of a deserted lookout point. He turned to her, his face a mask of agony and ancestral duty. "You don't understand. This isn't a syndicate war. It's a blood feud. They want a sacrifice. If I go alone, I might be able to negotiate for the boy. If you're there, they'll burn the whole mountain down just to ensure you don't leave it." Nya didn't flinch. She leaned in, her eyes locking onto his with a fire that eclipsed the distant city lights. "You are still trying to hide me. Even after the divorce, after the tea house, after I stitched the skin back onto your shoulder, you are still trying to treat me like a liability to be tucked away. You think I'm going to sit in a basement while you trade your life for a child that they weaponized against us." "He is my son, Nya," Derail roared, the sound echoing off the cold stone of the ridge. "And I am your queen," she shouted back, her voice echoing louder. She reached out, grabbing his lapels and pulling him toward her until their foreheads pressed together. "You told me we were a partnership. You told me I was the hand that swung the sword. Well, the sword is dull if the hand is cut off. You want to save that boy. You won't do it by surrendering. You'll do it by letting me lead the hunt." Derail's breath hitched. He looked at her, not as the wife he needed to shield, but as the strategist who had outplayed the council. Nya saw the shift in his eyes, the moment the desperate father gave way to the lethal king. "I know the Iron Crag," she continued, her voice dropping to a low, tactical hum. "I've already mapped the heat signatures. They're expecting a grieving father to crawl to their gates. They aren't expecting a digital blackout and a thermal breach. I am taking command of this mission, Derail. You provide the steel, but I provide the path. We save the boy, and then we show Minhee exactly what happens to ghosts who try to haunt my house." Derail looked at the woman before him, her dark curls framing a face of pure, unadulterated fury and brilliance. He realized then that he hadn't just married a woman. He had allied himself with a force of nature. He slowly reached out, his hand trembling as he cupped the back of her neck, pulling her into a kiss that tasted of rain and desperation. "Lead us then," he whispered against her lips. "Command your king." The sky over the Gyeongsang border did not just break, it shattered. Great jagged veins of violet lightning ripped through the charcoal clouds, illuminating the Iron Crag fortress in terrifying, strobing flashes. Perched precariously on a shelf of black rock, the stronghold looked less like a building and more like a jagged extension of the mountain's own malice. Thunder followed each flash, a guttural roar that Nya used to mask the sound of their approach. She moved with a lethal, predatory fluidness, her charcoal tactical gear blending into the wet stone. Beside her, Kim was a mountain of silent efficiency, his movements perfectly synchronized with hers. They had bypassed the main winding path, opting instead for a vertical ascent up the western face, a route the Red Peony Society deemed impossible. Nya gripped the wet granite, her gloves providing a high-tech friction that defied the downpour. Below them, the world was a swirling abyss of mist and rain. Above them, the prize was a child who shared the blood of the man she loved. Nya tapped her earpiece, her voice a low, modulated hum that barely registered above the wind. "Derail, we're at the perimeter. The primary gate is a diversion. I'm initiating the digital blackout now." She pulled a compact, ruggedized tablet from her utility belt. Her fingers danced across the screen, deploying a localized electromagnetic pulse that she had spent the last 2 hours tailoring to the society's archaic but functional security grid. On her screen, the fortress's thermal signatures flickered and died. The perimeter cameras dipped their heads like wilted flowers, and the high-voltage wires humming atop the stone walls went silent. "Going dark," she whispered. Kim threw a weighted grappling line with a practiced flick of his wrist. The carbon fiber hook bit into the stone battlements with a dull thud, swallowed by a well-timed crack of thunder. Nya was the first up the line, her muscles coiling and releasing with explosive power. She crested the wall, rolling into a low crouch as her thermal goggles flickered to life, painting the world in shades of predatory blue and orange. The courtyard was a labyrinth of traditional wooden corridors and stone gardens, now populated by guards in dark robes who were frantically checking their dead radios. They were warriors of a bygone era, trained in the old ways, and they were utterly unprepared for the ghost in their machine. Nya signaled to Kim, who dropped beside her like a shadow. "The boy is in the central pagoda, 3 levels down," Nya directed, her eyes fixed on a heat signature that was smaller and more vibrant than the rest. It was a tiny pulse of life in a fortress of stone and steel. The fury she had felt at the temple had crystallized into a cold, unbreakable resolve. She wasn't just here to save an heir. She was here to prove that the foreign consort was the most dangerous thing the Red Peony had ever encountered. A bolt of lightning struck the peak above them, bathing the courtyard in a blinding white glare. For a split second, Nya was visible, a golden-eyed specter of retribution standing atop their sacred walls. Before the thunder could even roar, she was moving, a blur of motion heading straight for the heart of the stronghold. The siege had begun, and the mountain was about to learn that some queens didn't need a throne to rule, they just needed a target. The central pagoda was an island of deceptive serenity amidst the storm. Nya slipped through the heavy oak doors, her thermal goggles retracted to reveal a room bathed in the flickering, amber light of floor lanterns. The air smelled of aged cedar and incense, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of rain and adrenaline outside. Kim held the perimeter at the doorway, his silhouette a grim sentinel against the lightning, while Nya moved toward the inner sanctum. There, tucked behind a screen of carved jade, sat the boy. He was smaller than he had seemed in the photograph, a fragile figure huddled on a silk floor cushion. He wasn't crying. Instead, he was staring at the door with a terrifying, stoic stillness that made Nya's heart skip a beat. As she stepped into the light, he looked up, and the breath left her lungs. It wasn't just the physical resemblance, the sharp bridge of the nose or the slant of the brow. It was the gaze. The boy looked at her with the same guarded, ancient intensity that Derail carried, a look of a soul that had already learned that the world was a place of shadows. He wore a traditional dark blue dalbak, the silk shimmering under the lanterns, making him look like a miniature prince in a gilded cage. Nya felt her pulse thrumming in her throat. This was the threat. This was the blood purity the Red Peony Society worshipped. She had expected to feel a pang of resentment, a reminder of a past where she didn't exist. But as the boy's lower lip gave a single, microscopic tremble, the anger evaporated. In its place rose a fierce, primal heat. This child wasn't a political pawn or a biological insult. He was a boy who had been stolen, hidden, and weaponized against the only father he had ever known. "Jiha," she whispered, using the name she had seen on the DNA report. The boy tilted his head, his eyes tracking the tactical gear she wore, then settling on her face. "Are you the shadow lady my mother warned me about?" "No," Nya said, kneeling so she was at his eye level, her movements slow and deliberate. She reached out, her gloved hand stopping just short of his shoulder. "I'm the one who's taking you home." In that moment, the mission changed for her. It was no longer about securing her throne or proving her worth to a dying sect of traditionalists. She looked at the boy's eyes, Derail's eyes, and saw a future that needed protection. She felt a maternal protectiveness so sharp it was physical, a vow echoing in her mind that no ghost, not even Minhee, would use this child as a sacrifice again. A sudden crash echoed from the upper levels, the sound of the society's inner guard realizing their sanctuary had been breached. Nya didn't flinch. She stood up, reaching for the boy's hand. He took it, his small fingers disappearing into her grip. "Stay behind me, Jiha," she commanded, her voice dropping into the lethal tone of a queen preparing for war. "Anyone who wants to get to you has to go through me first." The amber light of the floor lanterns flickered violently as the sliding doors behind Nya were kicked open with a thunderous crash. Nya didn't flinch. She kept Jiha tucked firmly behind her, her hand steady on the hilt of her blade. She expected to see the robed zealots of the Red Peony Society, but instead, it was Minhee who stepped into the room. The ivory handbox she had worn at the temple was gone, replaced by a sleek, midnight black combat suit that mirrored Nya's own. In her hand she held a silenced semi-automatic, and her eyes were no longer filled with a mother's desperate tears. They were cold, dry, and hungry. "Move away from the boy, Nya," Minhee commanded, her voice devoid of its earlier melodic charm. Nya stood her ground, her gaze sweeping over the woman who had played the role of a grieving ghost so perfectly. "The rescue is over, Minhee. Derail is clearing the upper levels. You got what you wanted. Your son is safe. Now put the gun down before I make you regret ever coming back from the dead." Min-hee let out a sharp, jagged laugh that made Ji-ha shrink further into the shadows of the jade screen. "Safe. You think I brought him to this godforsaken rock because I wanted him safe. I brought him here because he was the only key that could open the door to Han D-Ryle's guilt, and his guilt is the only thing that could lead me to you." Nya's eyes narrowed as the pieces of the mother's gambit finally fell into place. The Red Peony Society wasn't the architect of this war, they were the distraction. "You don't care about the bloodline," Nya whispered, the realization chilling her more than the storm outside. "You don't even care about the boy." "I care about what he buys me," Min-hee hissed, leveling the gun directly at Nya's chest. "I spent 5 years in a hole while you sat in my seat, playing with the ghost accounts that were supposed to be my legacy. The society is a collection of dinosaurs, Nya. They want a pure heir. I want the $50 billion you moved into the dark web. You're going to give me the decryption keys, or I'm going to paint this pagoda red with the blood of the woman D-Ryle chose over me." The betrayal was absolute. Min-hee hadn't been a prisoner of the council. She had been waiting for the accounts to grow large enough to steal. She had used her own son as the ultimate bait, banking on D-Ryle's honor and Nya's newfound maternal instinct to bring the prize directly to her. "You're a monster," Nya said, her voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating hum. She could hear the heavy thud of D-Ryle's boots approaching from the hallway, but she knew he wouldn't make it in time. "I'm a survivor," Min-hee countered, her finger tightening on the trigger. "And survivors don't leave witnesses. The keys, Nya, now, or the boy watches his new mother die." Nya felt Ji-ha's small hand tighten on her sleeve. The boy wasn't looking at Min-hee with love. He was looking at her with the same terror he had shown the guards. The woman who had given him life had become his greatest predator. Nya shifted her weight, her mind racing through a dozen combat scenarios. The queen was cornered, but as she looked into Min-hee's greedy eyes, she knew one thing for certain. She would burn every cent of those billions before she let this ghost touch a single hair on Ji-ha's head. The heavy oak doors groaned on their hinges as D-Ryle surged into the room, his black tuxedo shirt torn and stained with the soot of the battle he had just fought through the upper levels. He came to a staggering halt, his chest heaving, his weapon raised. The scene before him was a nightmare carved from silk and shadow. Nya, his partner and his queen, stood like a shield in front of the son he had only just found. While Min-hee, the woman he had mourned for 5 years, held a gun to Nya's heart. "D-Ryle, stop," Min-hee cried out, her voice shifting back into that practiced melodic tremor. "She's trying to take him. She wants to use Ji-ha to control the accounts. Come to me, D-Ryle. Save our son from this stranger." D-Ryle's gaze darted between them, the barrel of his gun wavering in the amber light. The air in the pagoda felt like it was being sucked out by a vacuum. On one side stood the mother of his child, the ghost of a soft, untainted past he had once cherished. On the other stood Nya, the woman who had seen his darkness and mirrored it, the woman who had saved him from himself. Nya didn't speak. She didn't plead. She simply looked at him, her golden brown eyes steady and fierce, even with a barrel leveled at her chest. She saw the hesitation in his hands, the momentary fracture in his resolve as the weight of his pure, bloodline warred with the reality of the woman who currently held his son's hand. "D-Ryle, choose," Min-hee screamed, her finger tightening on the trigger, her mask finally slipping to reveal the greed beneath. "End this foreign infection and let us be a family again." The hesitation lasted only a heartbeat, but in the world of the 7 Stars Circle, a heartbeat was an eternity. D-Ryle's eyes clouded with an agonizing indecision, his past pulling at his soul with the strength of a tidal wave. He looked at Ji-ha, then at Min-hee, his weapon dipping just an inch. Nya didn't wait for him to find his footing. She saw the flicker of madness in Min-hee's eyes and knew that D-Ryle was too paralyzed by the ghost of his first love to act in time. She didn't scream for him to shoot. Instead, with a movement so fluid it seemed choreographed by the lightning itself, Nya reached into the hidden holster at her thigh. She didn't aim for the shoulder or the leg. She aimed for the threat. The crack of Nya's suppressed weapon was a dull thud against the roar of the thunder. A single, precise hole appeared in the center of Min-hee's forehead. The woman who had been his past froze, her eyes widening in a final, silent shock, before she collapsed backward like a puppet with its strings cut. Her gun clattered harmlessly onto the tatami mats. The silence that followed was absolute. D-Ryle dropped his weapon, his knees hitting the floor as he looked at the body of the woman he had once loved. Nya stood over them both, her gun still raised, her breathing shallow but controlled. She didn't look at the dead, she looked at the living. She reached back and pulled Ji-ha into her side, shielding his eyes from the carnage. The choice was already made, D-Ryle, Nya said, her voice a cold, vibrating chime of authority. She wasn't your past. She was just another trap, and I am the only one who is going to lead you out of it. The crack of the gunshot that ended Min-hee's life was still echoing through the rafters when the fortress itself seemed to scream in response. Outside, the rhythmic tolling of a bronze bell shattered the mountain's silence, a signal that the sanctuary had been desecrated and their leader had fallen. The Red Peony Society was no longer a collection of traditionalists. They were a hive of stirred hornets, and their buzzing was the sound of steel drawing against leather. "They're coming," Kim's voice crackled over the comms, punctuated by the staccato rhythm of his own weapon from the corridor. "The inner sanctum is compromised. We have 60 seconds before they swarm." D-Ryle surged to his feet, the devastation in his eyes hardening into a familiar, lethal frost. He didn't look at Min-hee's body, he looked at Nya. He saw her standing over Ji-ha, her gun raised, her posture unyielding. In the strobe light flashes of lightning from the open doors, she looked like a goddess of war carved from the very obsidian of the mountain. Without a word, he stepped to her side, his shoulder brushing hers, a silent vow of realignment. "Ji-ha, stay low. Hold onto my belt and do not let go," Nya commanded, her voice a calm anchor in the rising chaos. The boy nodded, his face pale but his eyes reflecting her own iron resolve. He gripped the fabric of her tactical suit, tucking himself into the narrow space between the two adults. The first wave of the Red Peony army burst through the paper screens, not with guns, but with the terrifying, silent speed of traditional assassins. They wielded geom swords that caught the amber lantern light, their dark robes billowing like smoke. Nya and D-Ryle moved as a single entity, a dance of lead and steel they had perfected in the shadows of Seoul. D-Ryle was the shield, his heavy-caliber weapon barking as he cleared a path toward the western exit, his movements brutal and efficient. Nya was the needle, her lighter, suppressed pistol snapping at targets that tried to flank them, her free hand occasionally reaching back to ensure Ji-ha was still anchored. They fought through the central pavilion, a storm of splintering wood and shredded silk. When Nya's clip ran empty, D-Ryle stepped in front of her, his body a wall of muscle and Kevlar, providing her the 3 seconds she needed to reload. When a swordsman lunged from the rafters toward D-Ryle's blind side, Nya's blade was already out, meeting the attacker midair with a spray of crimson. "The western gate," Nya shouted over the roar of the thunder. "Kim has the extraction vehicle idling at the base of the stairs." They descended into the heart of the battle, a back-to-back whirlwind of violence. The Red Peony soldiers threw themselves at the trio with a zealotry that defied logic, desperate to reclaim the pure air. But they were fighting a king who had found his purpose and a queen who had found her cub. As they reached the rain-slicked battlements, the lightning illuminated the path ahead, a descent into a sea of enemies, but for the first time since the gala, they weren't fighting each other. They were a dynasty under fire, and the mountain was learning that blood was only as strong as the hand that protected it. The transition from the blood-stained stones of the Iron Crag to the polished marble of the Seven Stars corporate headquarters was a blur of high-altitude extraction and cold, calculated planning. Nya did not spend the flight back to Seoul mourning the ghosts of the mountain. She spent it on her laptop, rewriting the narrative of the Han dynasty. By the time the wheels touched the private tarmac, the invitations had already been sent. This would not be a whisper in a dark room. It would be a roar that the entire underworld would have to acknowledge. The grand auditorium was packed with the city's most influential journalists, corporate rivals, and the stony-faced elders of the council. They sat in a thick, expectant silence, their eyes fixed on the empty podium. When the side doors finally opened, Nya stepped out first. She was a vision of absolute, unshakable authority, wearing a tailored suit of ivory wool, a deliberate, lethal nod to the traditional colors of mourning she had just laid to rest. Her hair was styled in sharp, modern waves, and her gaze held the cold light of a woman who had walked through fire and found it lacking. Beside her, D-Ryle moved with a measured, protective stride, his hand resting on the shoulder of the small boy walking between them. Jiha was dressed in a miniature charcoal suit that matched his father's, his face scrubbed clean of the mountain soot. He looked out at the sea of flashing cameras with the same stoic, predator-in-training gaze that had defined the Han men for generations. Nya stepped up to the microphone, the sound of her heels echoing like a countdown. She didn't wait for the murmurs to die down. She didn't look at the teleprompter. She looked directly into the primary camera lens, speaking to the enemies still hiding in the shadows. The Seven Stars Circle has always functioned on the strength of its legacy, Nya began, her voice a steady, melodic chime of power. For too long, that legacy has been guarded by secrets and threatened by those who believe they can use our blood against us. Today, the secrets end. She reached down, taking Jiha's hand and bringing him forward. The camera flashes intensified, a rhythmic strobing that illuminated the undeniable truth of the boy's features. "I am introducing the next generation of the Han Empire," she declared, her grip on the boy's hand firm and maternal. "This is Jiha Kareen Han. He is my son. He is the heir to everything we have built and everything we have yet to take. Let it be known that any hand raised against him is a hand raised against me. Any threat to his safety will be met with the full, unmitigated weight of the ghost accounts and the steel of our enforcers." The room erupted in a chaos of shouted questions and blinding light, but Nya remained motionless, a silhouette of grace and iron. She wasn't just claiming a child, she was reclaiming the definition of purity. By adopting the boy's narrative and weaving her own name into his, she had neutralized the Red Peony's leverage and silenced the council's whispers. Behind her, D-Ryle's eyes met hers, and for the first time there was no shadow of the past between them. They stood as a united front, a new bloodline forged in the ruins of a trap, proving that the queen didn't just protect the throne, she defined who was worthy to sit upon it. The penthouse was silent, the kind of silence that only exists after a storm has finally exhausted its rage. High above the neon veins of Seoul, the glass walls of the new nursery offered a panoramic view of the empire they had bled to protect. It was a room designed with a paradox of softness and security. Plush rugs and warm oak contrasted with reinforced ballistic glass and biometric locks. In the center of the room, tucked beneath a silk duvet, Jiha slept with a peace that had been denied to him for 5 years. His small chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, the only sound in the twilight. Nya stood by the crib, her ivory suit jacket discarded, the sleeves of her silk blouse pushed up to reveal the faint, fatting bruises from the mountain climb. She watched the boy's face, tracing the features that were so clearly D-Ryle, yet seeing something of her own spirit in the way he had gripped her hand during the press conference. She wasn't his mother by blood, but she was his mother by fire. She had walked into the mouth of a dragon to pull him out, and in doing so, she had transformed her role from a consort to a matriarch. A soft footfall signaled D-Ryle's arrival. He didn't approach like a king tonight, he approached like a man who had finally found home. He stopped behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her back against the solid warmth of his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his gaze fixing on the sleeping boy. "The council has gone quiet," D-Ryle whispered, his voice vibrating through her. "The Red Peony remnants are being purged as we speak. You didn't just save him, Nya, you made us untouchable. By claiming him as yours, you've rewritten the law of the circle." Nya leaned her head back against his shoulder, closing her eyes for a brief, rare moment of rest. They wanted a blood feud derail. They wanted to use the past to burn down the future. But they forgot that fire doesn't just destroy, it forges. She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, powerful thrum of his heart. The divorce papers, the betrayals, and the ghosts of the mountain were all ash now. They were no longer just two people bound by a contract of survival or a shared enemy. They were the founders of something larger, a dynasty built on choice rather than chance, and on a love that had proven itself more lethal than any weapon in their arsenal. "He will be a better man than I was," Derail said, looking back at his son, "because he will have a queen to teach him how to rule with more than just fear." Nya smiled, a sharp, beautiful expression that held the promise of 1,000 victories to come. She looked out at the city below, at the millions of lights that represented the lives they now controlled. The trap had been set on a Valentine's Day a year ago, intended to break them. Instead, it had forced them to build a fortress that no one could breach. "We aren't just surviving anymore, Derail," Nya said, her voice a low, commanding promise. "We are building a world." As the sun began to hint at the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold, the king and queen of the 7 stars stood together in the quiet. The war was over, but their reign, a dynasty of fire and iron, was only just beginning. I hope you enjoyed this journey with Nya and Derail. Please like and subscribe to see more stories like this. See you in my next video.